Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this Good Work session. We're very pleased to have Professor Edwina Pio join us for this Fulbright New Zealand Good Works presentation today. Professor Pio is going to speak to us on the topic of compassionate disruptors for diversity. Professor Edwina Pio is a recipient of a Royal Society Medal, a Duke of Edinburgh Fellowship, and is a Fulbright alumna as a recipient of a New Zealand Scholar Travel Award in 2013. Edwina is New Zealand's first Professor of Diversity, University Director of Diversity, and an elected Councilor on the governing body of the Auckland University of Technology. She's also been appointed to the Ministerial Advisory Group pertaining to the Royal Society recommendations on the Christchurch mosque shootings. Her research and doctoral supervisions encompass the intersections of work, ethnicity, indigenous studies, religion, spirituality, and pedagogy. A prolific writer, her research is published in leading international journals and media outlets, and she has written over half a dozen books. We're very excited to hear Professor Pio's presentation today, and I'm very pleased that so many of you could join us today on what is a beautiful sunny day here in Wellington at least. So thank you all for joining us. We will hand over to Professor Pio shortly, and just to note that there will be time for some questions after the presentation. So if you can hold your questions till the end, we will get to them then. And if you could make sure that you are muted throughout the presentation, that would be appreciated. So I'll hand over to Professor Pio now. Happy for me to share your slides?
Yes, please.
Wonderful.
Kia ora, maino tātou katoa, ko Edwina Pio tāku e noa. He tangata tiriti aho, no reira tēnā tātou katoa. Nau mai hare mai, e nā iwi, e nā rio, e nā maunga, e nā awa, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to each of you. I see many of my friends. I see a number of my doctoral students, past and present, and a number of colleagues, and of course to the Fulbright organizers, to Penelope and the others. Many thanks for inviting me for the wonderful title that you all have for the series, Good Works. Next slide, please. So what is diversity about? Well, it's a grand narrative, and it's become more or less the flavor of the last few years. Words that have been added to it are inclusion, belonging, and equity. I've put on this slide, is diversity a privilege? For many it is, particularly if I might say in the context of New Zealand and of many other countries. If you are white, you have the benefit of whiteness, and there's a lot of research that's been done in that area. It becomes the standard on the basis of which other ethnic groups are looked at. But it can also be a privilege if, for example, you are a Maori or Pacifica and an organization feels that they need to be able to employ more Maori and Pacifica people in the organization, then it might be a privilege. It can also be a debt. You feel that you are responsible for what your forebears, your grandfather, your great-grandfather might have done, and therefore it becomes a kind of a debt. I do get many people who say to me, we are white, we are not sure what to do about it. Well, there's nothing you can do about it, but enjoy who you are and be sensitive, as I say to everyone else. A lot of research has been done in the area of diversity being a penalty, particularly if you are an ethnic minority person. In New Zealand, a lot of research has been done on ethnic minority people, ethnic minority women who face various kinds of issues in employment, in society, primarily because people are not able to move beyond their visible diversity discriminators. They are us, we are them. Jacinda Ardern's words after the March 15th Christchurch mosques shooting. And I think that's key to understanding and to moving towards being compassionate disruptors for diversity. But right in 1893, when we got the right to vote in New Zealand, the first country in the world, and Kate Shepherd said, all that separates, whether of race, class, or creed, is inhuman and must be overcome. The picture that you see over there is in Parliament with one of the officials from the US Embassy. You can see the two flags over there. I thought it would be appropriate to put that. Next slide, please. In New Zealand, we have the Treaty of Waitangi signed in 1840 between the British Crown and Maori chiefs, not all of them, some of them, which encourages that all are treated with manakitanga or respect and care. The question I put over there is, can that be part of compassionate disruption? Next slide, please. In compassionate disruption, we are relating to each other. So in the wonder of relating to each other, what are some of the things we need to call to mind when we think of what's happening in our volatile world today? First of all, there is the changing demography. In New Zealand, you have many more migrants coming in, many refugees coming in. If you think of Ukraine, Russia, if you think of the corridors in Central America, in South America, Mexico, going towards the US, and if you think of Africa and the people in Africa moving towards Europe. So there is a changing demography that we need to be aware of. There's also religious diversity. And interestingly, almost every year for the last, I think, 5 or 6 years, Diversity Works has been doing a survey on diversity in New Zealand, looking at organizations, both large and small. We thought that religious diversity would feature higher up after the Christchurch mosque shooting, but it's still right down in the list of different things that people and organizations consider important, with gender, disability, bullying, flexible work hours being on the top. But we do need to factor in religious diversity as well. Linked to that is corridors of commerce. If you think of our beef and our lamb, the Middle East tends to be one of the top countries which take our beef and lamb because it is halal. So what are the corridors of commerce and how is China changing the balance of power? Then we've got to think of human rights. In New Zealand, we have 13 grounds on which discrimination is not allowed based on the Human Rights Act 1993. So when we are looking at compassionately disrupting for diversity, what are the different things we have to think of? Is it age? Is it disability? Is it gender? Is it marital status? Is it sexual orientation, political beliefs, etc.? And of course, in the last few years, we live 24/7 lives. And that's why often when you read different books about reducing toxicity in our lives, they often say, switch off your electronic gadgets. And therefore, in a rearranged world, what are some of the things we need to do differently? I've had the privilege of interacting with the last 4 prime ministers, and that's why you see the picture there. There's one with 3 people, and that's my son, whom I like to have around on one of the slides. Next slide, please. What is diversity? Diversity is like life through stained glass windows. You can see the background that I have, which are stained glass windows. Diversity can be fragmented, cobbled, imperfect. It can be beautiful. And I've put there some quotes of people who I thought were interesting. The first one, Alan Alda, He's an American actor, screenwriter, and is best known for playing Captain Benjamin in Hawkeye and the war comedy drama MASH. So he says, begin challenging your assumptions. How often do we scrub off our own windows to see that our eyes are clearer and our thoughts are clearer in terms of what we do and how we interact? Many of you would have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. COVID time, some of us experienced deaths, either in our family or those close to us. And she says, people are like stained glass windows. They sparkle and shine when the sun is out. But only when the darkness sets can the true beauty be revealed from within. You can read the others, but I'd just like to remind you of the last one, which Bill Gates says, people everywhere love windows. So, and that's what we use a lot in terms of how we operate in our day-to-day life. The next slide, please. The genesis of my research. So why do I do what I do? First of all, I live my ethnicity. So when I came to New Zealand as a migrant many, many years ago, I suddenly become a scholar of color. It's something one has to contend with, that's the reality, and experiences in a predominantly white culture. And the question I kept asking myself is, am I making a difference? And I'm sure many of you in the audience, if not all of you, continuously ask yourself that question, am I making a difference? And because I'm an academic, I try and do my service through scholarship and research. Hence, for example, this talk on good works. As Morgan said in the introduction, I'm New Zealand's first professor of diversity. I also received a Royal Society medal, the Tirangi Hiroa Medal, for the work I do in diversity. I chair Te Kupenga, the Catholic Theological College of New Zealand, and I'm also on the Ministerial Advisory Board, Kapuya, which deals with the 44 recommendations made after the Christchurch Mosque shooting. So I'm putting this down here because as I talk, I hope that each of you is also thinking about your wonderful journeys and about what you do and what you have done in terms of living in this beautiful country, or if you have joined from elsewhere in the country where you are. Next slide, please. When we are talking of compassionate disruptors, we are talking of an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is like a bubble of life, of the environment, of trees, of nature, of the people we interact with. And in its simplest avatar, diversity is difference. What is disruption? And if we look at the Latin root of it, it means to break apart, to change, to interrupt privilege, to change power structures. Now, I've deliberately called the session compassionate because I think it's important that when we change power structures and change structures of privilege, that we do it with compassion. The Dalai Lama said, compassion is the new radicalism. And compassion, the root of compassion is from compati. It means we are altruistic. Our heart and mind is oriented towards the suffering of others, but also towards ourselves. Do we care for ourselves? Do we care for others? If you think of the ancient Indian scriptures, the Upanishads, they say abundance is scooped from abundance, and yet abundance remains. So we have to nurture ourselves as well. And therefore, compassionate disruptors are those who intertwine and shape cognitive. So you notice, you feel, And you go beyond that. You act so that you can impact the ecosystem. And when many people choose to be compassionate disruptors, you can disrupt the whole ecosystem. Now, compassionate disruption, of course, is a little different from what happened at Parliament a few months ago with reference to COVID. So we won't go into that, but the kind I'm talking about is a bit different from that aspect. The next slide, please. And these are some of the books that I've written in my endeavor to look at compassionate disruption. And again, as I'm talking, I would like you to think what you are doing so that you affirm yourself in the area of being a compassionate disruptor. An early work was SARI, Indian Women at Work in New Zealand, which was released by John Key. The next one I wrote was Cast Away, Unfolding the Maori Indian, so people who have mixed ethnicity. Longing and Belonging, which is about, at that time, 10%, it's more than 15% of people who identify as Asian, Middle Eastern, Latin American, and African. That was followed by Work and Worship. Then Faith-Based Violence, and I was invited to New York to speak with Congress. It was a press conference on faith-based violence well before the Christchurch attack. And last year, Reimagining Faith and Management. So despite the fact that in New Zealand, we have more than half the population who say they don't have a religion, people are still religious, people are still spiritual and faith-based. Full screen me, please. So what I'd like you to do right now is to think about, how are you a compassionate disruptor? What are some of the things you think you do, have done, or can do in your life's journey to be a compassionate disruptor? And, people are welcome to share. So the Fulbright people are keeping an eye out. If anyone would like to raise their hand, that would be great. And you can give us some examples, perhaps, of what you do. We'll wait a minute or so in case someone would like to be bold enough to raise their hand. And then we will continue.
We have Arti Patel, if you'd like to speak.
Yes, happy to speak. Thank you so much, Edwina. We connect from way back, and you remind me of my days when I used to be lecturer at the School of Pharmacy. I found at that time one of the things was encouraging people to use their own names, because saying names, I am never known as Arti, I'm known as Artie. The R is silent. And I know I actually stand up and I get taken aback when somebody says my name properly. And so in talking to my students and sort of saying, as hard as sometimes or difficult and challenging it can be, your name was given to you with a special meaning. Let us learn, let us try to do it. That's just a very small example, because I know what it means to me to have it said properly. Thank you.
Thanks, Arti. Lovely to see you. Anyone else wants to share one of their thoughts? Okay, next slide, please. So the question is, why are we here So you've joined today. It's your precious time, your energy. And I've said we are here as people for the session, also in New Zealand or if you're elsewhere, because New Zealand is an extraordinary space. And we believe that compassionate disruption can shift shapes and transform possibilities if we use the power of communication and design wisely. I'd like to draw attention here to the fact that we need to use this wisely because as we know, radicalization takes place. A lot of it is through online sites and echo chambers that take place over there. So how do we dream the world into existence and so that it's not a deficit discourse? I'm sure very often we have clouds of gray in our lives, but how do we look for that silver lining so that we can look at being compassionate and with that disrupting what's happening? And I've put there, we need a sophisticated practice. So life is never just black and white. It's always shades of many colors, whether it's the rainbow, whether it's shades of gray, whether it's shades of red or blue or green, based on our political parties. And so what hopes shall we gather? And what dreams shall we sow? In the words of Sarojini Naidu, who was known as the Nightingale of India, a poetess. And there are 3 questions over here. Again, if you'd like to respond, that would be great. If not, that's fine. You can respond internally. How have you experienced a diversity challenge? What are your top 3 challenges in diversity? And what am I putting back into the kete or the basket of life or knowledge for the privilege of living in this country? So what are we giving back? Again, would anyone like to respond to that?
If anyone would like to respond and puts their hand up, Lauren, I might need you to invite them to speak as I can only see the full screen presentation on my little laptop.
Not to worry, and you are all welcome to put your comments if you'd rather put them written in the box too.
So we have diversity around us everywhere. It's a fact of life. And we do get challenged by diversity in terms of whether it's, I had someone ask me today, do you believe that a man can marry a man? Okay, so LGBTIQ sexual orientation. I have people who ask me questions. Do you think it's okay for someone to wear the veil and to cover her face as well and only show her eyes and be employed in my organization? So that's a challenge for them. Do you agree that people should pray 5 times a day, even if they are at work, and go out to pray during that time? Do you feel that people can speak in their own language at work, or is it disrespectful to others who don't know that language? So these are some of the questions that come to me frequently in my work on diversity. And therefore, I always say, what are you putting back for the privilege of living in this country? It's so easy to say, I didn't get a job because I was discriminated against, because of my color, because of my ethnicity, because of my accent. Maybe those are factors, but that might not be the whole story. So therefore, why are we here? And what's the meaning of us being here, whether it's in an organization, whether it's today for the session, whether it's why am I here on this planet? I happened to be at Great Barrier the other day, Great Barrier Island, and one of the things that's a dark sky reserve. So we were lucky to have, the wonderful, wonderful sky, and we could see with the naked eye Jupiter and Saturn and all these other planets and stars and satellites, which Elon Musk is putting up over there, and shooting stars. And you realize there how tiny we are just a microcosm of the macrocosm. The reason I'm saying this is because sometimes we take ourselves too seriously. So what am I putting back into the kettle for the privilege of living in this country? Next slide, please. So about me, which really means about you, the people who are here today, each one is diversely different. And when you think of yourself, what distinguishes you from others? I've deliberately put a picture with a Christmas tree because I still get people today asking me, should we wish each other Merry Christmas? I said, well, do you wish people Happy Diwali? Do you wish Happy Ramadan? So what makes your heart skip a beat? And sometimes we have to bundle something that's not so nice with something that's nice in order for us to move forward and be a compassionate disruptor. The third point, this week I will. So what's one thing you're going to do this week to epitomize being a compassionate disruptor? What are your daily calming essentials? It is very easy to get angry. End of this chronological year, people are exhausted, they are tired, people are shifting offices, people are shifting homes, they're unable to pay their mortgage. So what are your daily calming essentials? Or you've realized you've got cancer. And finally, which everyone loves, what's your favorite food? Okay. I see someone, oh, that's Emma. My heart skips a beat when meeting another neurodivergent person. Thanks, Emma. Okay. I think Aarti had also put something up in the chat box, but I can't see it. If any of the Fulbright people can see it, perhaps you could read that out.
Yeah, I can read that out. So it said, time facilitating engagement and understanding. I think that might have been in reference to one of your former questions too.
Okay, thank you. Can we have the next slide, please? I've put Global Indices 2021. Sometimes we think that in New Zealand, well, women are not really treated well, etc., etc. But if you look at the Global Gender Gap Index, we are number 4 internationally. And I've put China and India because we have a large number of migrants from those countries in New Zealand, and they are countries with very big populations. So you see the Corruption Perception Index. New Zealand is number 1, and I've put the US, of course, because of Fulbright. US is 15, and the lowest is South Sudan. So New Zealand tied with Denmark and Finland. Doing business, we are supposed to be the best in the world. US number 6, India 63, and China 31. Somalia the lowest. Economic Freedom Index, number 4. New Zealand. Global Gender Gap Report, number 4. US is 30. And the Prosperity Index, we are number 8. So we do pretty well on the global indices. And I've deliberately put that there. So when we feel depressed and grumpy with what's happening and feel we can't make a difference, well, we are here as migrants, as refugees, as people who continue to live in New Zealand, precisely because net, we feel it's still a better place. So those are the global indices for you, done by the World Bank, by the World Economic Forum, by the Legatum Prosperity Index. Thank you. Can we have the next slide? So here are some questions to ponder on. And this picture was taken at the recent Diwali function in Parliament with Priyanka Radhakrishnan, who's our first minister for diversity and inclusion. And she was telling me that when she chose to stand for elections, many people said, why don't you change your family name? It's impossible to pronounce, Radhakrishnan. And she checked with Jacinda, and Jacinda asked her, what would you like to do? And she said, well, I'd like to keep my name. And she said, I don't want to take my husband's name because his name is as long as mine. So I'd rather keep my name. So these are little things to think about, which are really big things. For example, as Aarti said earlier, one of the participants, that teaching people to seeing that we pronounce the name of people correctly. So here are some questions for us to ponder on. What narratives and designs do we create on and for Aotearoa and the world? What do we talk about in these narratives? Are we talking about the silver linings? Who speaks and whose voices are heard? So think of your organizations. Who speaks? In a meeting, many people from Asian countries take much longer to speak than those from non-Asian countries. So if you're waiting for someone to speak, it doesn't mean they can't think or they don't have the intelligence. So who speaks and whose voices are heard? Who is the wise outsider and insider? So I'd like you to think here again, when you have your meetings in the office, who are you listening to? Who is part of your circle? And I often ask, if this was a face-to-face, but you're welcome to reply or think about it, who are in your circle of friends? Are they people just like you? Do you also have people who are not like you in your circle of friends? What data is collected and how is it disaggregated? So for example, in terms of the pay gap, women in New Zealand are being paid more than they were in the past, and the pay gap is decreasing between men and women. But when you look at women and you delve down further and look at women who are not white, their pay gap is much more. So what's the kind of data we are collecting? How is it disaggregated? Who do we collaborate with and why? Because remember, when we are being compassionate disruptors, we want to change the bubbles in which we operate. Who is community for me? And therefore, how can we be compassionate disruptors and not prisoners of images which others create? So I mentioned earlier, I become a scholar of color when I come here. So I have had people who have asked me, I tend to take public transport, go in early to work, leave late. If I was a janitor or a cleaner, because I said I work at the university. So I was thinking, what are they responding to? And they're probably responding to my skin color. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So here are 3 actions you can think about in terms of being a compassionate disruptor. First of all, what's the diversity around you? Among your friends, in society, in your organization, in your communities. Find out what that is, and in the different forms of diversity, including, for example, neurodiversity. The second action is exposure to tales of difference. What are the different kinds of stories we tell each other and we allow ourselves to listen to when others tell these different stories? And therefore, how do we circumvent diversity phobia? I've had a number of women who come to me and say, please guide us because we have men with certain ethnicities in our organization. We are the leader, but they won't listen to us. because they see us as being women. So how can we circumvent that diversity phobia? And I'll tell you a few stories in this regard, or tales of difference. I was at a shop, clothes shop, doing some shopping. I finally picked up something that I liked, and when I went to pay for it, another lady was in the shop with her daughter, and she rushed to the counter and said, "I'm going to pay for this. I don't know who she is." And she said, "Well, I'm just paying it forward. I'm very happy today. My daughter's back from university, and I've decided the first person who's buying something in this shop, I'm going to pay for it." And she wouldn't listen. And her daughter was going to buy something. And I said, "Can I buy that for your daughter?" And she said, "No, you can do that somewhere else and pay it forward." We've also got, for example, another example where I was at a bookshop, and some of you may have heard this story before, and I was looking at the spines of the books. It was in New Zealand because I was writing my next book and was thinking of how to, display it so that it looks really nice. And a woman in the shop was watching me. She was part of the shop, employed there. And after some time, she comes to me and says, "Perhaps I should take you to the children's section because you're likely to understand that writing better." So that's another example. Now, I could have chosen at that point in time to say, well, I'm a professor and how dare, etc., etc. But, I felt out of the goodness of her heart, she was trying to be helpful. But that also speaks to the fact that I thought, what is she responding to? And she was probably responding to my skin color. And in her experience, people with my skin color perhaps did not read English. Another example, which is I was in the Netherlands, in Nijmegen to be exact, and I was at a market over there where they were selling fruit and vegetables and various other things. And I love cherries, and I was going to buy some cherries, and I said, "Can I buy just a few?" And a Dutch lady came to me and offered me money. And she said, "Here's some money, you can buy as much as you want." And I was leaving the next day, so I just wanted a little. And I was highly embarrassed that she was offering me money till I realized when I told my colleagues at the university, and they said we had a host of refugees last week in the same area. And she must have thought, "You're a refugee, let me give you some money." So she was trying to be a compassionate disruptor. And I was trying to be a compassionate disruptor by saying, "Well, thank you very much. She didn't speak English. I don't speak Dutch, but I'm not going to take your money." And one more final example that I'd like to give, which is in Boston. I've been visiting professor at Boston College for many, many years, a Jesuit institution. I had a wonderful dean there. He died a year before last at the age of 84 or 85. And he would go out of his way to see that students, that staff were always happy. He'd be the first to come in, the last to leave, and was always available for others. That was his way of being a compassionate disruptor. He was a very strict man, very disciplined, but always available. So if we expose ourselves to tales of difference, he was a white man as well. The third action is, can we have an expanding circle of compassionate disruption? So if today we are compassionately disruptive in our family, can we expand that to other areas of our life? Next slide, please. Awesome Aotearoa. As a compassionate disruptor, can I gift hope and laughter? I was reading a book called about laughter, and it's with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. And on the cover, both of them are laughing. So can we gift hope and laughter? And can we create communities of hope and horizons of possibility? After all, as the Maori whakatoki goes, he waka e ka noa, and its many interpretations. We are all in this together. The butterfly effect, a butterfly in Beijing can create a rainstorm in Chicago, as we know. Next slide, please. These are some references. If you put my name into Google or Google Scholar, you will find a lot of references. And if you're interested, you're welcome to read them. They are a range of different writings. Some are magazines, some are journal articles, and some are books. Can I have the next slide, please? And that's my last slide, so we have time for questions. And that's my son in Antarctica. He worked there for a year at Scott Base. And let it be said of each of us that we give much back in return. Before we move to questions, I'd like to quote from Hafiz, a 14th century poet, who said, "I sometimes forget I was created for joy. My mind is too busy. My heart is too heavy to remember I was called to dance, the sacred dance of life." And I think compassionate disruptors dance the sacred dance of life. Kira, thank you. Questions?
First, I'd just like to thank you, Edwina, for such a wonderful presentation. I think is very inspiring for all of us, and the compassion with which you approach this, what must be at times very difficult work, is amazing, and I think a really good lesson and inspiration for everybody. So thank you so much for that. And yes, if we could open to questions, if people would like to either type them into the chat or raise their hands, and we'll go through that way. Got some thank yous and lovely comments in the chat from Coral. It says, thank you for your beautiful examples of compassionate disruptors. Sarah, again, thank yous from Sarah and Savita. Looks like we have a question from Rory. If you'd like to go ahead.
Edwina, thank you. I obviously love your work, but I'm struggling with the concept of compassion, be towards what some might see as an abusive relationship, I guess. When I think about racism or inequalities in the workplace, I think about power difference. So there are some that have power and some that don't have power, and the people that don't have power tend to be the ones that are discriminated against. And so I guess having that, showing compassion to those in power, as I said, I'm struggling with that. How do you get over that sense of pain and unfairness, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Rory. Good to see you. Rory is my colleague at AUT. I think there will always be power differences. There will always be power differentials. There will always be injustice, unfortunately. But I think, first of all, is being compassionate towards ourselves and knowing that if someone is being racist, unjust to us, examining ourselves. Second is, what can we do to nudge? We need to be able to nudge in terms of compassionate disruptors. Sometimes it might involve building a coalition with other colleagues. Sometimes it might involve giving them or talking about certain things that one has read, or a whakatoki or a poem that can help. It's tough being a compassionate disruptor because you need to be compassionate to understand that, I mean, each of us, I believe, has a divine spark. And so you're respecting that part, even though you're not respecting the behavior of that individual. So, and you have to protect yourself as well. So therefore you decide how much you want to nudge and how much you can nudge. But sometimes it's persistence that pays off.
Do we have any other questions? You're welcome to pop them in the chat if you didn't want to speak.
I think one of the things also when one is thinking of injustices and trying to deal with it through compassionate disruption is to have in your mind role models and people who have dealt with really difficult situations. I mean, if you think of Nelson Mandela, and if you think of Mother Teresa, now you might say that these are people who are like way above, the way I am as a person, but it helps to steer us towards how we want to go and where we want to go. I have found that useful because, I mean, in my role as diversity, I get, besides bouquets, I also get brickbats because one can never satisfy everyone. And I also work in the area of radicalization. So people are not too happy with some of the things that I say or do. But I think keeping oneself centered, and that's why I quoted from the Upanishads, where it says, abundance is scooped from abundance, and yet abundance remains. So we nurture ourselves so that we can deal with difficult things. And I'd like to also hear quote Buddhist Zen saying, where they say, if the if the world is full of stones, nails, and things that hurt your feet, remember to put on slippers.
Well, if we don't have any further questions, we might end there. Thank you so much, Professor Pio, for your presentation and for spending time with us today. And thank you all for joining us. It's a wonderful turnout. And yeah, I think we've all gotten a lot from this session. So thank you so much. And have a good rest of your day. Thank you.